very much for organizing this. I would like also to thank all of you for being there. I would like to thank all the sponsors of this event, and mainly Samsung for his continuous support for education. I would like also to thank Long over there, who will be my translator today, I think. I hope I will not give him too much work. And I will start this course about SGA and IUGR. So this is really important topics in our field. Is the translation working okay? Okay? Yes? No? Yes? Good. So first, as a start, I would like to remind you that this year, our World Congress for ISUOG will be organized not far from here in Seoul, Korea. So we would be extremely happy to welcome all of you in Seoul. There will be a very exciting program in a fantastic city where you will have plenty of opportunities to entertain, but also to learn with us. So please do come to Seoul this year, October 2023. So let's start about SGA and IUGR. Basically, why do we care about these topics? Because we know that any fetus, when it departs from optimal growth, either in the direction of growth restriction or in the direction of microsomia, then there is an increased risk of morbidity and mortality. And if you focus on growth restriction, which is most often related to placental insufficiency, we know that it has direct consequences to the fetus at short term, at medium term, and also at the long term, because we know now that placental insufficiency may have consequences in the adult to come, so like 40 or 50 years later. It also has consequences to the mother with an increased risk of preeclampsia, of emergency C-section, etc., etc. So it's important to try to screen appropriately for SGA and IUGR. And basically, if you look at the literature, very simply, we know that we are not good at that. That the screening performances when you screen for IUGR are not good, whatever the studies and whatever the predictor you are using, either third trimester ultrasound or mid-trimester ultrasound. So in this presentation, I will mainly relate to 3 documents. There are 2 important guidelines that were published by ISUOG. The first one is about the assessment of fetal biometry and growth. And the second one is about diagnosis and management of SGA and growth restriction. And I would highly recommend you to look at these guidelines. And the third document is an article which I think is really important. It's an article that defines growth restriction. And it may think very obvious, but if I ask you, what is a fetus that is growth restricted? What is it? It's extremely difficult to define, and for years there were many definitions, and with this paper a few years ago the authors managed to get a consensus among several experts to define what is a growth restricted fetus. And I think it's very important because we can now all speak the same language and define what is a growth restricted baby. So to start with, I would like to remind you that there are different definitions and different terminology. IUGR means a fetus that fails to reach its growth potential. And we know that in many cases, this will be associated with morbidity and mortality. It is different from SGA. SGA is a fetus that is below a given threshold, okay? We know that a lot of fetuses who are SGA, and mainly the one with the most severe smallness, are also growth restricted. But some fetuses are just small constitutionally without being growth restricted. And on the opposite, we know that most babies who are growth restricted will be SGA, but not all of them. And there could be some babies with a normal weight, but still did not reach their growth potential. So there is some kind of overlap between SGA and IUGR, but it's different. And the problem is that there is no clear diagnostic test to say this fetus is growth restricted or this fetus is small or not small, because we are only using ultrasound, or mainly using ultrasound, to try to measure the biometry of the baby. And with such a tool, it does not give us a clear definition of a small baby or of a growth restricted babies. It's not like when you are screening for Down syndrome, where you can do an amniocentesis and know whether the baby is affected or not affected. There is no perfect test to say if a fetus is small or not small, or to say if a fetus is growth restricted or not restricted. So that complicates a lot the problem. So if you look at our guidelines, we will start by saying that it's an essential component of prenatal care, of course, to screen for growth restriction, and that you have to understand the difference between fetal size, which is the biometric measurements at a given time point, from fetal growth, which is by essence a dynamic process. So if you would like to define fetal growth, you would need at least 2 different observations in time. It is extremely important, if you want to start discussing about fetal biometry and fetal growth, to be working on a fetus that has been appropriately assessed for gestational age. This is of utmost importance. You must define gestational age, and this must be done based on first trimester ultrasound by using the crumb length measurement. And it's extremely important to define gestational age in all pregnancy, and from now we will assume that we know the gestational age. Because you all know that such kind of observation might relate to a baby that is indeed small or growth restricted, but it could also be some error in gestational age assessment. And if there is an error in gestational age assessment, it's impossible to evaluate fetal size and fetal growth. Okay? So it's clear from our guidelines, and it includes the first trimester guidelines, and Liona will be talking about the first trimester guidelines tomorrow morning, that you should assess gestational age in the first trimester based on crumb length measurement. Then later, if you want to assess biometry, size, and growth, you will measure the biparietal diameter, the head circumference, the abdominal circumference, and the femur length. It has to be done properly, following quality criteria that we will discuss later on, and you should use the appropriate definitions and terminology. And these are the terminologies that we recommend. We recommend to use appropriate for gestational age or small for gestational age when it's below the 10th centile, large for gestational age when it's above the 90th centile, and we recommend to use fetal growth restriction whenever it encompasses the criteria for growth restriction, and we will see that later on, and to differentiate between early growth restriction, which is growth restriction happening before 32 weeks, from late growth restriction, that is growth restriction happening after 32 weeks. So these are the basic measurements. You can, of course, recognize BPD, HC, abdominal circumference, and femur length. And you should carefully interpret all these parameters separately. And you can also compute estimated fetal weight based on these measurements. You know that estimated fetal weight is a combination of head circumference, abdominal circumference, and femur length. And you can also report this estimated fetal weight on estimated fetal weight charts. It is very important to report estimated fetal weight on estimated fetal weight charts, not on birth weight charts, because birth weight charts reflect a significant proportion of prematurely grown and retarded neonates. So reporting estimated fetal weight on birth weight charts could be misleading, and you can see here on the slide that there is a clear difference between an estimated fetal weight chart and a birth weight chart, because again, there are a lot of growth-restricted babies that are born prematurely on birth weight charts. If you are to compute estimated fetal weight based on biometric measurement, it's very easy. You should use the 3 parameters ad hoc formula that is shown on this slide. There is a clear consensus from everybody to use this formula, which is the one that performs the best, and it's impossible to do any better at that stage. Many authors have tried to publish new formula that could compete with the ad hoc one, but no one managed to perform any better than the 3 parameters ad hoc formula, which is definitely the one that you should be using. You should use quality control to assess the quality of your images. So you can use either qualitative quality control, which is based on criteria on your images, but you can also use quantitative quality control that is based on the analysis of the distribution of your measurements. And for this, using Z-score makes things much easier. It has been proven that quality control improves the quality of your examination and the precision of your measurements. So now that you've measured HC, AC, femur length, maybe you have computed estimated fetal weight, the big question is on which chart should you report these measurements? I don't know if there is in Vietnam a consensus on the chart you should be using. Maybe you are using Vietnamese charts, I don't know, but it's a big debate all over the world to know whether you should be using local descriptive charts. So for example, charts that are based on the Vietnamese population, or whether you should use internationally developed charts that may reflect how a fetus should grow anywhere in the world under optimal conditions. And this is a big debate all over the world, because we all know that there are differences among different charts computed all over the world. And we know, for example, that for a given measurement, for example, at 32 weeks, the 50th centile for one chart could be equal to the 10th centile on another chart. And that's a big issue. You may think, well, this is a way to cure growth-restricted babies, because if you think that this baby is small, just look at it using another chart, and it's not small anymore, and it's not growth-restricted anymore. Of course, you cannot do that. You have to use a given chart, but again, it's difficult to decide whether to use descriptive charts or prescriptive charts, which should show you how a baby should grow under optimal conditions. Because if you are to use descriptive charts, for example, these babies in Tanzania, they are all stunted, they are all growth restricted. But if you were to develop normal charts based on these infants, you would think that these babies or these infants are normal, whereas they are not normal. They are all stunted. They are normal for Tanzanian infants, but they are not normal on a more universal thinking. And the same applies for this American family. If you were to compute normal charts for weight in the US, you would think that being obese is normal, because almost 40% of the population over there is obese. So you can see the problem of the definition and of the choice between descriptive charts that will apply to a population, but that will make 10% of the population small and 10% of the population large, whatever happens, and prescriptive charts that would be more universal charts. And there is really a big debate all over the world. I don't want to enter this debate right now, but for ISUOG, we said that it would be probably more appropriate to use prescriptive charts all over the world, because these defined how individuals should grow, and this was recommended by the World Health Organization. So this is an example of prescriptive charts, the one from Intergrowth that were published now 8 years ago in the Lancet. It shows you what is the normal distribution of different biometric measurements, and you've got the equation to use them in any software or in any ultrasound machine. As we've said at the beginning of this, prescriptive charts all over the world, because these defined how individuals should grow, and this was recommended by the World Health Organization. So this is an example of prescriptive charts, the one from Intergrowth that were published now 8 years ago in the Lancet. It shows you what is the normal distribution of different biometric measurements, and you've got the equation to use them in any software or in any ultrasound machine. As we've said at the beginning of this talk, it's important to differentiate between fetal size and fetal growth. And fetal growth, again, is a dynamic measurement. And if you are to analyze fetal growth, it's not optimal to use conventional charts, because these charts were not meant to do that. And we don't know exactly what was the trajectory of the fetal growth of these different individuals within this chart. But still, you can try to assess fetal growth and the dynamic of fetal growth based on such charts, and you can understand how much important is assessing the dynamic of the measurement. Because if I give you only that point, only that measurement, you have a small idea of how the baby is doing. But if I show you this second measurement, this second point in time, then it gives you a completely different interpretation. And if I give you a third measurement, then it changes again, and you have a completely different picture of how this baby is growing. So it's important to assess the dynamic of fetal growth, and we have recommended that third trimester scans may be used different based on local resources and local guidelines. And if you want to assess the dynamic of estimated fetal weight, you should wait at least 3 weeks between 3 different measurements. You may assess as well the quantity of amniotic fluid as part of your biometric assessment of the fetus. You could use either subjective or objective methods to assess amniotic fluid. There is no clear consensus on that. And we have also recommended that in any case you discover a small baby or growth-restricted babies, you should refer this mother to a referral center, and of course you should refer her as a matter of emergency if there is an abnormal umbilical Doppler blood flow with absent or reversed end diastolic blood flow, or if there are any maternal symptoms such as hypertension, then you should refer the woman as a matter of emergency. We also recommend to use Z-scores because it's more straightforward than centiles, but of course you know that there is a strict correspondence between Z-scores and centile, and you've got this correspondence on this slide. It's all okay, Long? You're surviving? Okay. So let's move on. The consensus definition of fetal growth restriction, that is very important, because just to illustrate what I'm saying, this is a slide where you can see different growth restriction definitions that were used in different studies over the past 10 years. And you can see that there is no common definition of growth restriction until that recent paper that I want to comment on. And then we will see how to manage this problem of growth restriction. And there is a guideline now from ISUOG about the diagnosis and management of smallness and growth restricted babies. So what is important is that fetal size alone, which is measuring the fetus, measuring the head circumference, measuring the abdominal circumference, measuring the femur length, or even computing the estimated fetal weight, is not enough to screen for fetal growth restriction. You need something else. You need more things. You need a combination of things. And these other things are growth velocity, the dynamic of growth, we've already talked about that, and the Doppler measurement. It's extremely important. And then within growth restriction, as I said at the beginning of this talk, you need to differentiate between early fetal growth restriction, which is before 32 weeks. Usually, it's easy to diagnose. Usually, it's severe growth restriction. It's easy to diagnose, and the problem is to manage. When should you deliver the baby? That is the main issue. Is it too late? Is it too early? And there is late growth restriction, which is growth restriction after 32 weeks. This is much more difficult to diagnose because often the woman will not have any ultrasound scan up until delivery, and it's only at delivery that you will discover that there was a growth restriction. And it's difficult to diagnose, but it's not that difficult to manage, because usually when you will diagnose growth restriction late in pregnancy, you will decide to go for delivery. So it's important to differentiate these two types of growth restriction, early and late. And again, there has been a consensus now on what is fetal growth restriction based on experts, and you've got this consensus on this slide. It's a very important slide. You can see that you will define early fetal growth restriction as growth restriction before 32 weeks. And what is it? Of course, it's in absence of any congenital anomalies. And it's either a baby with AC or estimated fetal weight below the third centile. So being below the third centile is enough. Or having an absent end diastolic blood flow in the Doppler. So it's very important. Having an absent end diastolic blood flow in the umbilical Doppler alone is enough to define early fetal growth restriction. Or it could also be a combination of being below the 10th centile for AC or estimated fetal weight and having a uterine artery PI or an umbilical artery PI above the 95th centile. That's again a definition of early growth restriction. And late growth restriction is almost the same, but it's after 32 weeks. It could be either being below the third centile, it's enough, or a combination of being below the 10th centile and having a decrease in fetal growth, a decrease of more than 2 quartiles. What does that mean? It means, for example, on a first ultrasound examination, you are at the 80th centile, and then at another ultrasound examination, you are at the 20th centile. So it's a drop of 60 points. So that defines, again, growth restriction, more than 50 points of centile, or having a cerebral placental ratio or an umbilical artery PI that is abnormal. So this is the new definition of growth restriction. It's extremely important. How will you manage early growth restriction? Very briefly, because it can depend a little bit on local resources and local policies, you will need to use monitoring of the fetal heart rate and Doppler assessment. Doppler assessment is extremely important to assess the fetal well-being. You will use uterine artery, umbilical artery, middle cerebral artery, and ductus venosus. And in early fetal growth restriction, which is again growth restriction before 32 weeks, it's difficult because you have to balance between the risk of continuing the pregnancy with the main risk of having intrauterine fetal demise or fetal brain abnormalities related to hypoxemia, to severe hypoxemia. You have to balance this risk with the risk of being born extremely prematurely and the risk of prematurity. And basically, you have to remember that between 24 and 28 weeks, there is a major change in the prognosis with an improvement in survival of almost 2% per day. You can maintain the pregnancy going on. So you will try to maintain the pregnancy as much as possible until 28 weeks of pregnancy, and you will really have to wait for extremely abnormal markers to decide to deliver a baby before 28 weeks. Basically, these late markers of high risk of intrauterine demise are mainly the short-term variability of the fetal heart rate and the ductus venosus. This has been very well proven in the truffle study. I do not want to enter too much into the details of the study. Basically, it was a randomized study of early growth restricted babies where they looked at the outcome in 3 different groups. There were 3 different groups of pregnancy. They were randomized between 3 different triggers for deciding to deliver the baby. And these 3 different triggers were either abnormal computerized CTG, early ductus changes, or late ductus changes. And they were able to demonstrate that basically in this study, first, the overall prognosis was better than expected. And this is probably the effect of having a same management protocol in all the pregnancies. And they were also able to demonstrate that the group with the best outcome were the group where they waited for the late changes on the ductus venosus. So this is probably the appropriate trigger for delivery, except that there was also what they called a safety net in all these groups. And the safety net was abnormalities on the CTGs, severe abnormalities on the CTGs, such as decelerations or abnormal short-term variability. And you can see that it was a short-term variability below 2.6 at the early gestational age, or 3 between 29 and 32 weeks. So these are probably the good triggers: abnormal CTG or low short-term variability or late changes in the ductus. These are the appropriate trigger for delivery in early growth restriction. And it's probably the appropriate trigger up to 30 weeks, because from 30 weeks, if you have a reverse end diastolic blood flow in the umbilical Doppler, you should probably deliver. And you should also probably deliver from 32 weeks onwards if you have an absent end diastolic blood flow in the umbilical artery. So this was shown by many studies, and these are the results of some meta-analysis of these studies, which shows that clearly from 32 or 34 weeks, if you have an absent end diastolic blood flow in the umbilical artery, then you should deliver. And you should do the same from 30 weeks if you have a reversed end diastolic blood flow. So this is for early onset IUGR, and we will go back to that a little bit later on. For late FGR, it's a little bit more complicated because we've said that it's difficult to diagnose late FGR. Probably you should rely on cerebral-placental ratio to decide who are the truly growth-restricted babies late in gestation, and you should also try to rely on dynamic of fetal growth, just as shown on this study. You can see that this baby is small, but he has no growth restriction. The dynamic of growth is normal, whereas these 2 fetuses are not small, but still they are growth restricted. And it was shown that among babies that are small for gestational age, the morbidity occurs in those babies who have a slow dynamic of growth. So the problem is not being small, the problem is having an abnormal growth, and it was very well demonstrated in that study by Sovio. So basically, late fetal growth restriction will lead to delivery, of course, in any case if you have maternal indication, or if you have abnormal CTG, or if you have a low short-term variability, of course, if you have an absent end diastolic blood flow. And if you see signs of abnormal umbilical artery Doppler, or if you see signs of severe smallness that are enough to define growth restriction, you will decide to deliver these babies. So as a summary of all of that, you can find in the ISUOG guidelines this slide, which is a kind of sum up of all our guidelines about how to take care of growth-restricted fetuses depending on the gestational age and that will show you which trigger you should use to decide delivery. Of course, you may add other things in your management, including magnesium sulfates or steroids to improve the outcome of the baby. And you have to remember that whatever your protocol, you will never be able to avoid all intrauterine fetal demise. That will still occur whatever your protocol. And this is mainly because late in gestation, most of the intrauterine fetal demise that may occur, even related to placental insufficiency, will occur in babies that are not small, because in late placental insufficiency, hypoxemia will occur before growth restriction occur. So that's important to understand that you will never be able to avoid all intrauterine demise. And also it's important to keep in mind that probably we tend to overestimate the proportion of the fetus that are dead in utero and that are also growth restricted, because between the moment the death occurs and the moment you will deliver the baby, the fetus will lose some weight, and that will tend to overestimate the proportion of the fetuses that are considered to be growth restricted when they are dead in utero. So these are the take-home messages of this talk. Again, extremely important to appropriately assess gestational age based on crumb length in the first trimester, appropriate measurements with quality control, appropriate use of the appropriate charts, and there is a debate on that, as you've understood. We suggest to use prescriptive charts, understand the definition and the difference between size and growth, use the appropriate terminology, Z-scores, SGA, FGR, appropriate tool to assess growth, the consensus definition of fetal growth restriction, extremely important, appropriate management and reporting, and understand that once the biometric component is fully standardized for all healthcare providers, then we will be able to improve our screening for FGR by using other tools, and mainly Doppler and dynamic of growth. Thank you very much.